I'm a country boy through and through. My name is Bill Carlson, and I proudly hold a degree in animal husbandry. From as far back as I can remember, my dream was simple yet fulfilling: to own my own feed store and to start a loving family. After I finished my college education, I married my high school sweetheart, Della. We had grown up together, sharing countless memories, and she was the only girl I could ever envision spending my entire life with. Della was breathtakingly beautiful, with her long, flowing brunette hair and a figure that remained stunning even after giving birth to our two wonderful children. I was incredibly proud to have her as my wife and would have done anything to make her happy. However, Della had a particular problem. She was deeply envious of the lives led by the socialites she read about. She would eagerly flip through the society pages of the newspaper and subscribe to every glossy magazine that featured the glamorous lives of the rich and famous. On the other hand, during my visits to the dentist, I preferred to immerse myself in car magazines, and soon I knew everything there was to know about fancy cars and high-end fashion designers. Della's greatest desire was to elevate her status and become somebody important, a wish that unfortunately I couldn't fulfill. I eventually secured a job in Omaha at a high-end feed store that catered to the affluent yuppie crowd. This new position brought us closer to the bustling city, allowing me to continue working in a field I loved while experiencing a different pace of life. I thrived in my job, excelling in providing exceptional customer service, which the company rewarded by offering me flexible hours. Della seemed to flourish in the city much more than she ever had in the country. She soon landed a job at Gilbert Medical, a company specializing in manufacturing syringes and other medical supplies. This office job was a perfect fit for her, as it allowed her to dress up and socialize with people who were far removed from our farming community. She threw herself into her work with enthusiasm, but in doing so, she started to lose interest in our home life. I found myself taking on most of the household responsibilities, dropping the kids off at daycare, picking them up, cooking meals, cleaning the house, and even ironing clothes. We had been diligently saving money each month with the hope of one day buying my own feed store. But suddenly, our savings began to dwindle at an alarming rate. Despite Della's new job and additional income, we found it impossible to save anything. The high cost of daycare was one factor, but most of our money seemed to vanish on Della's frequent trips to beauty salons, nail salons, and expensive clothing stores. I was baffled at how we could both be working hard and yet save less money than before. Every time I tried to discuss our financial situation with Della, she became defensive and angry. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up altogether. Instead, I quietly opened a separate savings account and started working overtime to stash away whatever I could. Meanwhile, Della's behavior grew more suspicious. She began having private phone calls, became less attentive and affectionate, and started wanting extravagant things like a new, fancier car and even breast implants. There was no doubt in my mind, Della was having an affair. Though I might be a simple country boy, I wasn't naive. I realized that at this point, I didn't even want to save the marriage. I just wanted to fix everything and move on before it was too late. I couldn't pinpoint exactly who she was seeing, but I was certain it was someone from her workplace. At my job, I worked with a couple of decent guys. They weren't overly polite, but they were hardworking. Although I was technically their boss, I never played the boss card, preferring to treat everyone with respect. The work always got done smoothly, without me needing to give explicit orders. Everyone knew what needed to be done, and we collaborated seamlessly. The guys appreciated this approach, and it fostered a strong, positive relationship among us. Roy and Freddie, in particular, would become valuable allies in my plan. I had noticed that on Wednesdays, Della always wore her fanciest underwear and her best clothes. She seemed to take extra time getting ready for work. I decided it was the perfect time to start my investigation. I confided in the guys about my suspicions, and they graciously covered my deliveries and appointments for the day. I parked next to the entrance of the Gilbert Medical Plant parking lot, which provided me with an excellent opportunity to catch up on some overdue technical reading. Around 11 a.m., Della emerged and got into her car. It wasn't difficult to tail her, and within minutes, she parked at the Holiday Inn. She chose a spot at the west end of the parking lot, far from the office. Moments later, a man in a red Corvette pulled up and parked at the east end. I didn't recognize the car, but as soon as he stepped out, Della got out of her car too. They walked together to an outside room on the second floor, number 117, and then went inside. The man already had the key. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a knot of nausea in my stomach. All I had done was confirm my worst fears. Unsure of my next move, I decided to head back to work and take my time planning my next steps. Before leaving the parking lot, I got out of my truck and used my baling wire cutters to cut two of his valve stems, one in the front and one in the back. I was furious, and it gave me a small sense of satisfaction. I don't know why I didn't do more damage. The rest of the day dragged on painfully slowly. After work, I picked up the kids, went home, and made dinner. When Della came in, I casually asked how her day had gone. She replied it was fine, but mentioned she had a flat tire. One of the guys at work had changed it for her, and nothing more was said. The next morning, I stopped by the factory after dropping the kids off at daycare. It didn't take long to locate the red Corvette. As luck would have it, it was parked in a reserved spot with a sign reading, Ken Beauchamp, Distribution Manager. That afternoon, I learned everything there was to know about good old Ken. Most importantly, I discovered he was already married. He had received a reprimand for making sexual advances towards an employee and was having issues with his expense accounts. I obtained his address, phone number, cell phone number, and even his social security number. But I still wasn't sure what I was going to do with this information. Ken had been married for 8 years, and his wife's name was Amy. We had a good day at work, and Roy, Freddie, and I had time to grab a beer before I picked up the kids. I still wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I knew I would come up with something soon. I tried to stay calm and logical in the face of the situation, but my anger grew each day. Occasionally, I found myself crying silently, feeling broken and unable to fix myself. Living with Della was becoming increasingly unbearable. I just wanted this nightmare to end. I had another stroke of luck the next day when I remembered that one of my best clients, Jake Gilbert, was the wife of the president of Gilbert Medical. Although I had never met her husband, Jake and I got along very well. I decided to be especially nice to Jake, hoping to find out more about if I could use our relationship to my advantage, especially when Jake's daughter Alina arrived. Alina was in her final year of veterinary school, and she had a bright future ahead of her. While Jake went to the barn to work, Alina and I struck up a conversation that lasted for about an hour. I genuinely enjoyed our chat, feeling a bit of guilt afterwards, but it faded quickly. That weekend, I spent some time in the garage working on a welding project. I took a small piece of flat steel and meticulously welded 4 sharp points onto it. I crafted the tips using concrete nails to ensure they were incredibly hard and rigid. The plate, measuring about 6 by 6 inches, was going to be the first step in my plan to exact revenge for the harassment I had been enduring. I saw Jake again on Tuesday. He seemed a bit down as he unloaded the order, lacking his usual cheerfulness. That caught her attention immediately. "Bill, what's wrong with you today? Why are you so sad?" she asked with genuine concern. "I'm having some personal problems, Jake," I replied. "Sorry I'm not good company today." "Let's go for coffee, and you can tell me about it," she suggested kindly. We went back to the house and settled in the kitchen, which looked like something straight out of a high-end magazine with its stainless steel and granite finishes. I thought to myself, Della would love this. Jake put down her coffee and leaned forward, looking at me intently. "Well," she prompted. "How can you help me, Jake?" I asked, feeling a bit hesitant. "Well, I don't know unless you tell me the problem," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. I really didn't want to delve into the details, but eventually decided that maybe she could offer some insight. My wife Della works at Gilbert Medical, and I believe she's being coerced into having sex with one of her bosses. But I can't prove anything. "Why do you think this is happening?" Jake inquired, her curiosity piqued. "Little things mostly, but last week I found the two of them together at the Holiday Inn. My wife doesn't realize I know, and I don't know how to bring it up. I don't know if it's something she's being forced into or if it's something she wants to do. Our family life has deteriorated to the point where she doesn't seem to care about the kids or me. She seems to keep it a secret, and that's what really hurts, I explained, my voice cracking slightly. Really bothers me. Jake leaned in, her concern deepening. Who's the guy? She asked softly. I think his name is Ken Beauchamp. I don't know if Della works directly for him or if they are in different departments. I've never met him, I confessed, feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. Jake's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Do you want me to see if I can help? I paused, lowering my head as I weighed the decision. If you think something can be done discreetly, I'd love to try, but I don't want to make a big fuss. Okay, let me look into it. I'll see you next Thursday with that oatmeal delivery, Jake promised with a reassuring smile. I thanked her, feeling a glimmer of hope. As I got up to leave, I asked, Where's Alina? Back to school. She'll be home this weekend. Why don't you bring the kids over to meet her? Jake suggested warmly. Wow, this turned out much better than I expected. I'm sure Della will have no problem letting me take the boys on a field trip. It could be a nice weekend, I thought to myself, feeling a bit more optimistic about the upcoming days. The next morning, it was pouring rain. Della went back to carefully dressing for her special day, and I said nothing as I watched her. The routine had become painfully familiar. After dropping the kids off at the daycare, I stopped by work. The boys were ready to cover my morning shifts. Roy was going to use my truck, make my deliveries, and log entries. I would initial anything that needed my approval. As I handed over the keys, I felt a surge of gratitude for my colleagues. They were truly supportive, and their help was invaluable in this difficult time. I watched Della as she left, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. She was so meticulous, so focused on her appearance for someone who wasn't me. It stung deeply, but I knew I had to keep my emotions in check if I wanted to uncover the truth and find a way forward. That day, I decided to follow her again, determined to gather more evidence. I parked a safe distance away from the Gilbert medical plant and watched as she got into her car. Just like before, she drove to the Holiday Inn, and my heart sank as I saw the familiar red Corvette pull up. The same man, Ken Beauchamp, got out and they disappeared into the same room, room 117. The sight made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time for a confrontation. Instead, I took a deep breath and called Jake. I've got some more information, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. He's definitely meeting her at the Holiday Inn, same room every week. All right, Bill, I'll see what I can find out on my end. Hang in there, she replied, her voice full of empathy. That weekend, as promised, I took the boys to visit Alina. The kids loved the trip, and it was a welcome distraction from the chaos at home. Alina was delightful, and her warm hospitality made the day special. It felt good to see the boys happy, even if just for a little while. Returning home, I was greeted by Della's cold indifference. She barely acknowledged our presence, engrossed in her own world. The contrast between her demeanor and Alina's genuine warmth was stark and heartbreaking. I knew I couldn't let this continue. Something had to change, and soon. The following Thursday, Jake came through with more information. Bill, I've looked into Ken Beauchamp. He's been in trouble before for inappropriate behavior at work. We might have something we can use, but we need to be careful. Thank you, Jake. This means a lot, I said, feeling a renewed sense of determination. With this new information, I felt more prepared to confront the situation. I still didn't have all the answers, but I was no longer in the dark. And with allies like Jake, Roy, and Freddie, I knew I had the support I needed to face whatever came next. I would initial all the entries when I got back to work. Freddie brought his cousin's van to work, and I loaded a floor jack in the back. We had ingeniously attached my custom steel plate with its sharp points to the jack lift. Once all the trucks were loaded and dispatched for their deliveries, I made my way to the Holiday Inn. Right on schedule, Della arrived and parked in her usual spot. Ken followed shortly after, parking in the same spot as before. Once they entered the room, I waited about 10 minutes, giving them time to get settled. In the pouring rain, I pulled the jack out of the back of the van and carried it over to Ken's car. I slid the jack under the engine block and lifted it up, hearing the satisfying sound of nails piercing the oil pan within seconds. I then moved to the rear of the Corvette and repeated the process on the fuel tank. The sound of the nails popping through the tank and the ensuing gush of oil and gasoline were music to my ears. The whole operation took less than a minute. Next, I headed to Della's car and deftly recut 2 valve stems. Feeling a rush of adrenaline, I walked past Ken's car and nonchalantly flicked a lit cigarette out the window before driving away. In my rearview mirror, I saw flames shoot out, and moments later, the explosive sound of the Corvette going up in flames echoed behind me. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Della came home from work a little late that evening. She didn't bother with dinner and went straight to bed without a word. I spent the evening playing with the kids, bathing them, and tucking them in. That night, I chose to sleep on the couch. The next morning, Della stayed in bed as I got the kids ready for daycare. We had breakfast and left without her saying a word, and I didn't bother to ask her anything either. Her car was conspicuously absent from the driveway. Around 9 a.m., after loading all the trucks, I received an unexpected visit from Police Lieutenant John Fritz. He was a nice enough guy, but the circumstances were anything but pleasant. "Tell me about your work schedule yesterday," he asked, his tone professional, yet probing. "Just normal deliveries, nothing special. Why?" I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you account for your time around noon?" he inquired further. "I went to the office," I replied, maintaining a calm demeanor even as my heart raced, and took the previous day's delivery logs from my desk. I placed them in front of him. Each entry detailed the location, the item delivered, the time of unloading, and my initials. He glanced at the logs, a small chuckle escaping him. "That's a good log. Do you guys do that every day?" he asked, clearly impressed. "Would you like to see last month's records?" I offered, trying to stay cooperative. He shook his head, smiling again. "No need. This is sufficient." I couldn't tell if his demeanor was a good sign or not. "Do you want to tell me what this is about?" I pressed, eager to understand the reason behind his visit. Lieutenant Fritz seemed hesitant, but eventually relented. "There was a car damaged at the Holiday Inn in East Omaha yesterday. We're trying to find out if anyone knows anything about it." "Why me?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "Well, another car near the damaged one had 2 valve stems cut off. The car belonged to your wife. We wondered if it was a coincidence or not. First, I don't know what my wife's car was doing in the parking lot of the Holiday Inn. And second, what was her relationship to the wrecked car?" I replied, trying to feign ignorance and surprise. "The damaged car belonged to a partner she works with. Apparently, they were having a working lunch with some of the company's clients at the hotel, and it all happened while they were having lunch." "Did you talk to the people they had lunch with?" I inquired, trying to redirect the suspicion. "No, they couldn't remember their names," he said, sounding a bit frustrated. "Do you want to level with me, or are we going to play all morning?" He leaned back in his chair, his smile returning. "Do you know a guy named Ken Beauchamp?" he asked, watching my reaction closely. "I never knew the man, and that's the plain truth," I replied, keeping my expression sincere. "I believe you," he said, smiling yet again. "I don't like to get in the middle of domestic disputes, and I hope I never have to see you again. Here's my card. Call me before anything else happens." I took the card, feeling a mix of relief and tension. "Thank you, Lieutenant," I said, pocketing the card. As he left, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of foreboding. The web of lies and deceit was becoming more tangled, and I knew I had to tread carefully from here on out. The stakes were getting higher, and I couldn't afford any mistakes. "Okay?" He shook my hand firmly. "I'm sorry I had to bring this to your attention. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." "Okay." As he walked away, I added, "Thank you, but you didn't really tell me anything. Put the pieces together." After work, when the kids and I arrived home, Della's car was in the driveway. She was dressed casually and had dinner ready. She mentioned she wasn't feeling well and had called in sick. She still didn't say anything about what had happened the day before, so I didn't bring it up. She went to bed early, and I resumed taking care of the kids and sleeping on the couch. The next day, I was already up, getting ready to go to work, when I left with the children for daycare. After dropping them off, I went to the doctor's office and asked to be tested for STDs. Work was normal for a Friday. When I got home, Della was there again. After dinner, I told her I was taking the kids to spend the next day at one of my clients' farms. I asked her if she wanted to accompany me, knowing full well she would find a reason to refuse. She told me she had some shopping to do, and I didn't insist any further. I didn't care if it was a shopping trip or a date. The result was the same. Saturday with Alina and the boys at the Gilbert Ranch was wonderful. We spent the whole day having fun. Jake prepared a fantastic lunch for everyone, and I didn't want it to end. Alina loved the kids, and they seemed to really like her too. Mr. Gilbert wasn't there, so I hadn't gotten to meet him yet. Jake didn't mention our earlier conversation, and it didn't seem like Alina had heard about it. I hated to go home, but eventually, we had to. Della didn't ask anything about our day. She didn't care. The boys tried several times to tell her everything they had done, but she wouldn't listen. Finally, they stopped trying. She asked me why I didn't sleep in bed anymore, and I explained that, due to work problems, I tossed and turned a lot and didn't want to disturb her sleep. That was the last thing she said about it. The following week was totally normal. I noticed that on her special day, she hadn't made any special preparations, so I assumed that the appointment for that day had been canceled. That was fine with me because I had a lot of work to do. I went to see a divorce lawyer I had heard about, and she gave me brochures with lots of information. She had some blank forms to fill out that looked interesting. Everything went back to normal until the next Wednesday. She started by showering in the morning and then carefully combed her hair. She wore new, sexy black underwear and new perfume. She even had on new shoes. I was careful not to let her see me looking and hurried out with the boys. I was sure this was going to be a date day. After dropping the boys off, I drove by the plant and checked their parking space. A new Porsche Boxster was sitting in its slot. I jotted down the license plate number, feeling a new surge of determination. License plate, and hurried back to work. The guys were as excited as I was about the new developments. We rushed through all the morning deliveries and went back to our routine, making sure all the paperwork was in order. I was pretty sure John Fritz would figure it out, but we carried on regardless. We even took an extended lunch break. Roy continued with the deliveries while Freddie made a stop at the pool supply store and bought 2 large bottles of hydrochloric acid. I decided to have lunch with John Fritz. He looked at me curiously when I walked into his office with pulled pork sandwiches, French fries, and a couple of Cokes. I greeted him warmly and sat down across from him. He noticed something was up and grinned from ear to ear. I thought we could have lunch together and you could update me on the car damage case, I said, trying to sound casual. I needed to keep him occupied for about 2 hours. It was going to be a long lunch. While I was trying to be pleasant, Freddie was in the Holiday Inn parking lot. He found the Porsche Boxster and carefully poured acid all over the trunk, fenders, and hood. He cut the convertible top and poured acid all over the leather seats and floor mats. The dashboard also received a generous dose of acid. If that wasn't enough, he put a box of mothballs in the gas tank. The naphtha would do a nasty job on the engine if anyone started it. Whatever acid was left, he spread over the tops of the tires. Before leaving, he cut the valve stems of Della's car again. The whole operation took less than 15 minutes. The only downside was that I didn't know how long the two of them would be in the room. John and I chatted about trivial things for a long time. Finally, he couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked, a mixture of amusement and suspicion in his voice. "I just wanted to make sure I had a good alibi in case something happened to Ken Beauchamp's car today," I replied with a sly smile. John raised an eyebrow. "What's so special about today?" I took a bite of my pork sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "Oh, nothing much. Just thought I'd cover all my bases." As the conversation drifted back to more mundane topics, I couldn't help but feel a rush of adrenaline. Everything was going according to plan. Della and Ken would come out to find their cars wrecked, and I'd have a solid alibi thanks to my extended lunch with John. Later that afternoon, I went back to the office, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and anxiety. I had taken a significant step in my plan for revenge, but the real challenge lay ahead. Confronting Della and dealing with the fallout was going to be a delicate operation. When I arrived home that evening, Della was already there, acting as if nothing had happened. She didn't mention the car or the incident at all. Instead, she went about her evening routine, seemingly oblivious to the chaos that was brewing beneath the surface. As I played with the kids and tucked them into bed, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could keep this charade going. The tension was building, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. But for now, I was content to let the pieces fall into place, one step at a time. The pork sandwich was on sale, so I grabbed a couple. I pulled out my cell phone and called the daycare. "Hi, Alex. This is Bill Carlson. I'm going to be tied up at work this afternoon, and I was hoping you could call Della and ask her to come pick up the kids." "Thank you. I really appreciate it. You can call her at 874-3211, extension 117. You may have to ask for her by name. Try to call as soon as possible to make sure you find her. Thanks again." John leaned back in his chair and chuckled. Those pork sandwiches were great. All was silent for a while, and finally John broke the silence. "Do you think I should call Mr. Beauchamp and ask him how his car is doing?" "Why would you want to do that?" I asked, curious about his sudden interest. "You wouldn't happen to know where I can reach him, would you?" John probed further. I handed him Della's cell phone number and the number of room 117 at the Holiday Inn. "Pick one," I said with a hint of mischief in my voice. John put the phone on speaker and dialed the hotel number. After a few rings, Ken Beauchamp answered, sounding out of breath. "Hello? Who is this?" "Mr. Beauchamp, this is Detective Fritz. I was calling to inform you that we still have no leads on who damaged your car," John said, his tone professional. Ken's voice grew agitated. "Why are you calling here? How did you get this number?" John remained unfazed, continuing with the conversation. Meanwhile, I felt a surge of satisfaction. Everything was falling into place. The day was progressing better than I had anticipated. After work, when the kids and I arrived home, Della's car was in the driveway. She was dressed casually and had dinner ready. She mentioned she wasn't feeling well and had called in sick. She still didn't say anything about what had happened the day before, so I didn't bring it up. She went to bed early, and I resumed taking care of the kids and sleeping on the couch. The next morning, I was already up, getting ready to go to work, when I left with the children for daycare. After dropping them off, I went to the doctor's office and asked to be tested for STDs. Work was normal for a Friday. When I got home, Della was there again. After dinner, I told her I was taking the kids to spend the next day at one of my clients' farms. I asked her if she wanted to accompany me, knowing full well she would find a reason to refuse. She told me she had some shopping to do, and I didn't insist any further. I didn't care if it was a shopping trip or a date. The result was the same. Saturday with Alina and the boys at the Gilbert Ranch was fantastic. We spent the whole day having fun. Jake prepared a delicious lunch for everyone, and I didn't want the day to end. Alina adored the kids, and they seemed to really like her too. Mr. Gilbert wasn't there, so I hadn't gotten to meet him yet. Jake didn't mention our earlier conversation, and it didn't seem like Alina had heard about it. I hated to go home, but eventually, we had to. Della didn't ask anything about our day. She didn't care. The boys tried several times to tell her everything they had done, but she wouldn't listen. Finally, they stopped trying. She asked me why I didn't sleep in bed anymore, and I explained that, due to work problems, I tossed and turned a lot and didn't want to disturb her sleep. That was the last thing she said about it. The following week was totally normal. I noticed that on her special day, she hadn't made any special preparations, so I assumed that the appointment for that day had been canceled. That was fine with me because I had a lot of work to do. I went to see a divorce lawyer I had heard about, and she gave me brochures with lots of information. She had some blank forms to fill out that looked interesting. Everything went back to normal until the next Wednesday. She started by showering in the morning and then carefully combed her hair. She wore new, sexy black underwear and new perfume. She even had on new shoes. I was careful not to let her see me looking and hurried out with the boys. I was sure this was going to be a date day. After dropping the boys off, I drove by the plant and checked their parking space. A new Porsche Boxster was sitting in its slot. I jotted down the license plate number, feeling a new surge of determination. "I'm a policeman, Mr. Beauchamp. Have you bought a new car yet?" John asked, his tone nonchalant. "Yes, I did. Why do you ask?" Ken responded, clearly irritated. "I just wanted to make sure there was no repeat of the last incident. Is the car with you now?" John inquired, pushing just enough to get a rise. "Yes, it's in the parking lot. Are you all right?" Ken's voice had an edge of suspicion. "Let me check," Ken muttered, clearly moving towards the window. We could hear muffled sounds and a low moan as he looked out. He returned to the phone, his tone more panicked. "Something doesn't look good. I'll have to get dressed and go check it out. I'll call you back." "Okay, but Mr. Beauchamp, why aren't you dressed now?" John asked, feigning innocent curiosity. "It's none of your business. I have to go," Ken snapped before hanging up abruptly. John looked at me with a satisfied smile. "Happy? Of course. Look, I have to get back to work. If you have any questions, call me," I replied, trying to keep my relief in check. "Okay, maybe we'll have lunch again next week," John suggested. "I hope not. This will have to end soon before someone gets hurt," I said, knowing full well the precariousness of the situation. I went back to work, where Roy had the logs in perfect condition, and Freddie had disposed of the acid bottles in a place they wouldn't be found. Tonight at home promised to be interesting. Della had picked up the boys, but said nothing and went to bed early. John came to see me the next day. He explained all the damage to Ken's car and mentioned that Ken's insurance was now outstanding since the Corvette incident. The car was totaled, costing over $60,000. Ken insisted that I had something to do with it, even after John told him that I was with him when it happened. John knew I had orchestrated the whole thing but couldn't prove it, and I suspected he didn't really want to. I never asked Della how she managed to fix her tires, and no one volunteered any information. Since Della had never come clean about the situation, I decided it was time to end it all. My STD test came back clean, and I had filled out the paperwork for the lawyer to start the divorce process. I was thinking of going to the Gilbert Ranch this weekend with the boys, hoping Alina would be there. If not, we would spend the day with Jake. The weekend turned out to be great. Alina was there, and the kids were ecstatic. We spent the whole day having a wonderful time. It felt like we were a family, and I realized how much I missed her, and so did the kids. Alina still didn't know anything about what was going on, and thankfully, she didn't ask. Before we left, Jake winked at me and reassured me that everything would be fine. I was offered a new position about 100 miles away, which included more money, a better job, and the option to buy the company in a few years. It was a perfect opportunity, though it meant being farther from Alina. The following Wednesday, Della was back in her routine. I didn't know what car her boyfriend was using, but she was definitely getting ready for another rendezvous. As I watched her prepare, my resolve hardened. It was time to take the final steps towards reclaiming my life and ensuring a better future for myself and the kids. I assumed they would still be going to the same place. I knew I had to take action, but I hadn't really planned ahead. The boys and I were brainstorming our next steps when Jake Gilbert arrived. He motioned for me to come closer and told me to get in the car. Without a word, he drove us to the factory. He parked in the back, and we entered through a private door that led directly into Mr. Gilbert's office. Jake introduced us, and his secretary promptly brought us coffee. We chatted about trivial matters for a while, the atmosphere casual yet charged with unspoken tension. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer and asked, "Did you bring me here for some reason?" Mr. Gilbert laughed, his demeanor warm yet authoritative. "It's time to put an end to this show. Jake has informed me of what's going on, and I've done a little internal research. As soon as everything is in place, we'll get going. We should have all the information you need by the end of the day. If I do anything to embarrass you, Bill, I apologize in advance. It is not my intention to do anything to hurt you." We continued chatting to pass the time, and Jake noticed my smile when the conversation turned to Alina. I tried to stay composed, but my fondness for her was clear. The phone rang, drawing everyone's attention. Mr. Gilbert answered, "What's up?" He listened intently, then said, "Okay, thanks for the call." He hung up and turned to me with a knowing smile. "You know what to do now, right?" "Hop," I nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and anxiety. "Good. Everything is in place. We can get started. Ken and his wife are in their usual room at the Holiday Inn. Ken drove a company Benz to get there. That's against company policy, so they're bringing it back to the office. The plan was set into motion. I felt a rush of adrenaline as the pieces fell into place. The time for action had come, and I was ready to confront the situation head on. It's correct. Everything was consensual, and I wasn't coerced or threatened. "Thank you, Della. That's all I needed to hear," Mr. Gilbert said, his tone neutral but firm. "We will be preparing a statement to confirm this. Please stay put. Someone will be in touch with you shortly." He hung up the phone and turned to me, his expression serious. "It's time to bring this to a close. Ken is clearly in violation of company policy, and we'll handle this internally. As for you, Bill, it's clear that you've been wronged, and we'll do everything we can to support you through this." I nodded, my emotions a tumultuous mix of relief, anger, and sadness. Jake gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "We've got your back, Bill. You don't have to go through this alone." The rest of the day was a blur. The company took swift action against Ken, and Della's infidelity was brought to light. That evening, when the boys and I arrived home, Della was there, looking anxious and uneasy. She didn't say anything as I entered the house, and I didn't offer any words either. The silence between us was deafening. After putting the kids to bed, I sat down with Della in the living room. "We need to talk," I began, my voice calm but firm. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know about you and Ken," I continued, "and I know it's been going on for a while. What I don't understand is why you didn't come to me, why you didn't talk to me about how you were feeling." Della looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I'm sorry, Bill. I really am. I just felt so trapped and unhappy, and I didn't know how to tell you." "That doesn't excuse what you did," I replied, my voice softening slightly. "But I understand now. This isn't working anymore, for either of us. I've already started the divorce proceedings. It's better for both of us and for the kids." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I'll move out as soon as I can." The days that followed were difficult but necessary. I focused on the kids, ensuring they felt loved and secure during this transition. The weekends at the Gilbert Ranch with Alina and Jake provided a much-needed respite and sense of normalcy. Eventually, the offer for the new position 100 miles away came through. It was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life and create a better future for myself and the boys. Alina and I stayed in touch, and while the distance was challenging, our bond grew stronger. Della continued her relationship with Ken, but it was no longer my concern. My priority was my children and our new life. The final chapter of my marriage closed with a sense of resolution, and a new chapter began, filled with hope and possibility. As I packed up our things and prepared to move, I felt a sense of peace. The journey had been painful, but it had also been a path to discovering my own strength and resilience. And with Alina and the boys by my side, I knew we had brighter days ahead. It was consensual. Della's voice was steady, yet it carried an undercurrent of tension. "I'm glad to hear it. When you and Ken get back to the plant, we'll have the statements ready for you to sign. Can you put Ken back on, please?" Mr. Gilbert's tone was professional but unyielding. "Sir, how did you know my name?" Della asked, a hint of confusion and worry creeping into her voice. "Don't worry about it, Della. It's not important," Mr. Gilbert replied dismissively. When Ken got back on the phone, Mr. Gilbert instructed him to return to the plant so they could finalize the paperwork with the legal department. After hanging up, he turned to us and smiled. "Jake, why don't you take Bill out to lunch and come back in a couple of hours? The legal people should be done by then, and we can all go back to our normal lives." Jake and I headed out for lunch, and despite the emotional weight of the situation, I found it hard not to get emotional. The relief and gratitude I felt were overwhelming, but I managed to keep my composure. During our meal, Mr. Gilbert made me promise never to discuss the situation again or what actions had been taken. He also insisted that I keep everything from Alina, which I agreed to. Over lunch, I shared the news about my new job offer with Jake. She was genuinely happy for the kids and me, expressing her support and encouragement. After our meal, we returned to the plant, where I collected and notarized copies of Ken and Della's statements. Both swore that they had engaged in consensual sex outside of their marriages. The The jurists assured me that this would be sufficient for my lawyer to expedite the divorce process. Ken and Della were subsequently dismissed from the company. They had packed their belongings beforehand and were escorted out of the building. Ironically, neither of them had a car. Jake, ever the supportive friend, handed me her car keys and told me I could return the vehicle the next day. I dropped the papers off at my lawyer's house. She promptly made several copies of each document, ensuring everything was in order. One set of documents was earmarked to be sent to Ken's wife, adding another layer of consequence to his actions. That evening, as I drove back home, a sense of closure began to settle over me. The ordeal was nearing its end, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, I felt more equipped to face it. The promise of a new job and the unwavering support from friends like Jake gave me hope. When I got home, Della was already there, looking defeated. She didn't say anything as I walked in, and I didn't offer any words either. We both knew what had happened, and there was nothing left to say. The silence was heavy but necessary. Later, after putting the kids to bed, I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the day's events. The weight of the past weeks felt lighter, and for the first time in a while, I felt a sense of peace. The journey wasn't over, but I was ready to move forward, leaving the pain and betrayal behind. As I prepared for bed, I couldn't help but think about the future. The new job, the fresh start, it was all within reach. And with the boys by my side, I knew we had the strength to build a new life, one filled with hope and promise. The final chapter of this saga was closing, and a new, brighter chapter was beginning. I went to the bank and closed all our joint accounts. I paid off the remaining balances on the credit cards and promptly canceled them. Then I called the gas, water, electric, and phone companies to arrange for the utilities to be shut off by Friday afternoon. Next, I stopped by John Fritz's office and told him that I had been good. He laughed, appreciating the irony. I notified the landlord that I would not be staying for the next month, effectively ending my lease. At work, I gave my notice. My colleagues were happy for my new opportunity, but saddened by my departure. Freddie followed me to the Gilbert Ranch with my truck so I could return Jake's car. It was time to pick up the kids and head home. I dreaded walking through the door. Della's car was conspicuously absent from the driveway. When we arrived, she was sitting on the couch, crying. It was the first time she had shown any emotion throughout this ordeal. Beside her were 2 boxes filled with her personal belongings from work. I fed the kids and put on the TV to keep them occupied. Then I sat by Della's side, giving her a chance to talk if she wanted to. "You had to, didn't you? You had to ruin everything in my life? Why the hell couldn't you mind your own business? You weren't justified in getting into mine," she exclaimed, her voice filled with bitterness and self-pity. I was amazed at her perspective. She saw the entire situation as if everything revolved around her. She didn't care about the kids or me. She wasn't thinking about Ken's wife, Amy. Our family, our life, and our plans meant nothing to her. Her only concern was what she was doing at that moment. Nothing else mattered to her. I was relieved that I wouldn't have to spend the rest of my life with her. I didn't say anything. Instead, I went upstairs and took a long, hot shower, letting the water wash away the stress of the day. Later, as I was getting the kids ready for bed, Della came into the bedroom and closed the door. Her expression was one of resignation, but she said nothing more. The next day, I took the boys to work with me. We spent the morning getting everything in order for my departure. My colleagues helped entertain the kids while I wrapped up loose ends. I felt a mix of sadness and relief as I prepared to leave the life I had known for so long. As we drove away from the workplace for the last time, I couldn't help but think about the future. The new job, the new home, the fresh start, it all felt like a second chance at happiness. The boys were excited about the move, and their enthusiasm was infectious. I knew that with their support and the promise of a new beginning, we could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The weekend was spent packing and saying goodbyes. Jake and Alina were particularly supportive, helping with the kids and making the transition as smooth as possible. Alina and I shared a quiet moment where she expressed her happiness for my new opportunity and reassured me that everything would work out. By Monday morning, the house was empty and the moving truck was loaded. As we pulled out of the driveway, I took one last look at the place that had been home to so many memories, both good and bad. It was time to leave the past behind and embrace the future with hope and determination. Driving towards our new beginning, I felt a sense of liberation. The boys chatted excitedly about their new home, and I couldn't help but smile. We were on our way to a better life, free from the pain and betrayal of the past. With each mile, the burden grew lighter, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow grew stronger. I made sure there were no loose ends and that Roy and Freddie could seamlessly follow the system I had set up. We went to a few stores and picked up boxes for the move. I stopped by the Holiday Inn, and Della's car was gone, so I figured she must have had it repaired by now. Fixing the flat tires must have put a big dent in her shopping budget for the last month. Della wasn't home when we arrived. We only had clothes and toys with us. I left everything else there for Della to deal with. Of course, she didn't know that the next day, all services would be cut off. Damn, I was a son of a bitch. As we were pulling out of the driveway, Della was just parking. She stood by her car and watched us drive down the street, a look of confusion and maybe realization dawning on her face. I took the boys to Chuck E. Cheese, and we spent the night in a motel. The next morning, I took the children to daycare. I brought Alex cookies and treats and told her it was the children's last day and that I wanted them to enjoy it with their friends. Before I left, she pulled me aside. "What happened with your wife last week?" I didn't want to ask, but since you're leaving, I'm dying to know. She got very angry when I called her. She insisted on knowing where I got that number, and when I told her you gave it to me, she started swearing like a sailor. She didn't say anything when she picked them up, but I could tell she was very angry. "I'm sorry, Alex. I set you up," I admitted. Della was having an affair. She was at the Holiday Inn with her boyfriend, and I was hoping that if I had you call and interrupt her party, she'd think better of it, but it didn't work out. She ended up getting mad at both of you. I'm serving her divorce papers this afternoon, and the kids and I are leaving for a new job right after I pick them up. It was a low blow on my part, and I apologize for getting you involved. I went to see my divorce lawyer. I had it all worked out. I would keep the children, and Della would have visitation rights whenever she wanted. That was fine with me, because I didn't think she was interested in them. Everything else was split 50-50, but there wasn't much to talk about. There was no alimony, no child support, no cash settlements of any kind. I left her all the furniture, appliances, and fixtures. I really didn't want them. She kept her car. I didn't want it because it would just end up with flat tires. All I had to do was give the papers to Della. Unless she contested it, everything would be final in 3 months. A copy of Ken and Della's notarized statement was attached to the divorce papers. A small side note made by the attorney indicated that the declarations would be kept private if all terms of the divorce were agreed upon. When I got home, I saw Della's car in the driveway, so I knew she was there. I sat in the driveway for a long time, reflecting on our past. I had loved Della. She was the only girl I had ever been close to. I assumed our relationship was normal, and she hadn't even thought that I didn't provide what she wanted. She never let me know. With a deep breath, I finally went inside. The house was eerily quiet, the tension palpable. Della was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You had to, didn't you? You had to ruin everything in my life? Why the hell couldn't you mind your own business? You weren't justified in getting into mine," she exclaimed, her voice shaking with emotion. I listened silently, letting her vent. She still saw everything as revolving around her, without any concern for the kids or me. She wasn't thinking about Ken's wife, Amy, or the impact on our family. Her only concern was what she was doing at that moment. I was relieved that I didn't have to spend the rest of my life with her. Without saying a word, I handed her the divorce papers. She looked at them, her face pale, and then back at me. I didn't wait for her reaction. Instead, I went upstairs and took a shower, letting the water wash away the remnants of the past few weeks. Later, as I was getting the kids ready for bed, Della came into the bedroom and closed the door. She looked defeated, but she didn't say anything. The next day, I took the boys to work with me, and we prepared for our move. We spent the morning getting everything in order for my departure. My colleagues helped entertain the kids while I wrapped up loose ends. As we drove away from the workplace for the last time, I couldn't help but think about the future. The new job, the new home. It all felt like a second chance at happiness. The boys were excited about the move, and their enthusiasm was contagious. With each mile, the burden grew lighter, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow grew stronger. I was too dense to pick up on all the clues. I had failed her in many ways. What she did was deceitful on her part, but I felt it was partly due to my lack of attention. I knocked on the door of my own house, feeling a strange sense of displacement. Della opened the door, looking exhausted and worn out. "Do you want a drink?" she asked, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. I handed her the divorce papers without a word. She didn't open them, just stared at them and then back at me. I looked into her eyes and asked, "Why?" I couldn't tell if she was angry or sad. After a few seconds, she finally came clean. "He smelled like aftershave. You smelled like manure. He wore Armani suits while you wore jeans. He ate lobster and steaks while you ate ribs and burgers. He had a London fog coat while you wore a Carhartt. He drove a nice luxury car while you drove a truck. He had manicured fingernails while yours were always dirty. He had a real job, and you were still just a farm boy. Is that enough for you?" "I can go on all day if you want," she said, her words spilling out in a rush. "I expected a life you couldn't give me. I'm sorry we got married, Bill. I married you for all the wrong reasons. I should have realized you wouldn't be willing or able to give me what I really wanted. I saw you as a means to get away from my parents, and I didn't think enough. I'm so sorry, but I can't change how I feel. I love my children, but I regret having them. I know it sounds terrible, but I don't seem to have maternal instincts. I was hoping that by finding someone who could fill the empty holes in my dreams, I would feel satisfied. But that only made me feel less satisfied with my current situation. I'm sorry I cheated on you. I'm sorry I was a bad mother to our children. I'm not sorry for chasing my dreams and looking for something better." Her words cut deep, but I needed to hear them. "What about your wife? What about your husband? What about your children? What about your family?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, each question laden with the weight of our shared history. She looked away, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know, Bill. I don't have all the answers. I've made a mess of things, and I don't know how to fix it." I sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "Well, Della, I think it's clear that we need to go our separate ways. For the sake of the kids, we need to make this as painless as possible." She nodded, a look of resignation on her face. "I understand. I'll sign the papers, and we can move on." We spent the next few days sorting through our lives, dividing possessions, and making arrangements for the kids. I made sure there were no loose ends and that Roy and Freddie could follow the system I had set up at work. We went to a few stores and picked up boxes for the move. I stopped by the Holiday Inn and saw that Della's car was gone, so I figured she had it repaired. Fixing the flat tires must have put a big dent in her shopping budget for the last month. When we got home, Della wasn't there. We only had clothes and toys with us, leaving everything else for Della to deal with. She didn't know that all the services would be cut off the next day. I felt a twinge of guilt, but pushed it aside. As we were pulling out of the driveway, Della was just parking. She stood by her car, watching us drive away with a mix of anger and sadness. I took the boys to Chuck E. Cheese, and we spent the night in a motel. The next morning, I took the children to daycare. I brought Alex cookies and treats and told her it was the children's last day, wanting them to enjoy it with their friends. Before I left, Alex pulled me aside. "What happened with your wife last week?" I didn't want to ask, but since you're leaving, I'm dying to know. She got very angry when I called her. She insisted on knowing where I got that number, and when I told her you gave it to me, she started swearing like a sailor. She didn't say anything when she picked them up, but I could tell she was very angry. "I'm sorry, Alex. I set you up," I admitted. "Della was having an affair. She was at the Holiday Inn with her boyfriend, and I was hoping that if I had you call and interrupt her party, she'd think better of it. But it didn't work out. She ended up getting mad at both of you. I'm serving her divorce papers this afternoon, and the kids and I are leaving for a new job right after I pick them up. It was a low blow on my part, and I apologize for getting you involved. I went to see my divorce lawyer. Everything was arranged. I would keep the children, and Della would have visitation rights. Everything else was split 50-50, but there wasn't much to divide. No alimony, no child support, no cash settlements. I left her all the furniture, appliances, and fixtures. She kept her car. I didn't want it because it would just end up with flat tires. The final step was giving the papers to Della. Unless she contested it, everything would be final in 3 months. A copy of Ken and Della's notarized statement was attached to the divorce papers. A note from the attorney indicated that the declarations would remain private if all terms of the divorce were agreed upon. When I got home, Della's car was in the driveway, so I knew she was there. I sat in the driveway for a long time, reflecting on our past. I had loved Della. She was the only girl I had ever been close to. I assumed our relationship was normal and that she hadn't even considered that I might not provide what she wanted. She never let me know directly, and I was too dense to pick up on all the clues. With a deep breath, I finally went inside. The house was eerily quiet, the tension palpable. Della was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You had to, didn't you? You had to ruin everything in my life. Why the hell couldn't you mind your own business? You weren't justified in getting into mine," she exclaimed, her voice shaking with emotion. I listened silently, letting her vent. She still saw everything as revolving around her, without any concern for the kids or me. She wasn't thinking about Ken's wife, Amy, or the impact on our family. Her only concern was what she was doing at that moment. I was relieved that I didn't have to spend the rest of my life with her. Without saying a word, I handed her the divorce papers. She looked at them, her face pale, and then back at me. I didn't wait for her reaction. Instead, I went upstairs and took a shower, letting the water wash away the remnants of the past few weeks. Later, as I was getting the kids ready for bed, Della came into the bedroom and closed the door. She looked defeated, but she didn't say anything. The next day, I took the boys to work with me, and we prepared for our move. We spent the morning getting everything in order for my departure. My colleagues helped entertain the kids while I wrapped up loose ends. As we drove away from the workplace for the last time, I couldn't help but think about the future. The new job, the new home, it all felt like a second chance at happiness. The boys were excited about the move, and their enthusiasm was contagious. With each mile, the burden grew lighter, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow grew stronger. Her demeanor changed immediately. My questions infuriated her, and she no longer seemed to regret her actions. "I don't give a shit about all that," she snapped. "It's my turn. I want to live the life I've always dreamed of. A farmer husband and 2 dirty-faced bratty kids don't help me get it. I got your goddamn papers. Now get out so I can get on with my life." Well, that made things easier. I turned around and left without another word. When I picked up the boys, Alex told me to let her know if I needed her to make any more calls. I decided to call the power companies and told them not to disconnect the utilities until the end of the month. I guess I was a little embarrassed about my earlier actions. The divorce was final within 3 months, and I never heard from Della again. The lawyer confirmed that everything went according to plan. My new job was great, though I missed out on the opportunity to buy the business. Someone else snagged it, along with a quarter section of prime land attached to it. My boss mentioned they were planning to turn it into some kind of horse breeding farm. While my job was secure, my dream of owning my own place suffered a setback. 2 weeks later, construction began next to the feed store. We all speculated about what was being built, and finally, one of the boys asked the site engineer. It turned out to be a veterinary clinic for large animals. It sounded interesting, but I dismissed it as wishful thinking. They completed the whole building in less than 60 days. The new owner was scheduled to report on Saturday. The boys and I stopped by on our way to lunch out of curiosity. Suddenly, the 2 boys started yelling, "Alina! Alina!" There she was, looking better than ever with Jake by her side. Alina had graduated with a veterinary degree and wanted to raise show horses while running a large animal clinic. She was showing the kids around the new building while Jake and I caught up. We all went to lunch together, and Alina shared that she was also building a new house on the property to be close to her work. The boys and I were grinning from ear to ear all night on the way home. 5 years later, Alina was successfully raising beautiful horses, and her clinic was thriving. I had just opened my sixth feed store. The children now had two little sisters whom they adored. Jake and Mr. Gilbert came to visit every weekend. Interestingly, I never learned Mr. Gilbert's first name. As for Della, she never came to visit the kids. Our new life was filled with happiness and fulfillment, something I hadn't thought possible in the dark days following the divorce. Alina and I built a strong, loving family together, and every challenge we faced only made us stronger. The journey from heartbreak to healing was long, but looking at my family now, I knew it was worth every step.